Tonight we're stepping out into a dewy dawn on a Georgian estate, where the grass still holds the glimmer of last night's mist, and the scent of turned earth mingles with faint smoke curling from the manor's chimneys. You're walking past rows of orderly hedges and carefully scattered wildflowers, the kind of scene that feels both staged and oddly alive. Your shoes dampen instantly, which is fine, except you probably won't survive this particular morning's social expectations, because here, prestige isn't measured in money or meters, but in how many sheep lengths your lawn sprawls. Yes, sheep lengths. Actual, BAAing, wool-wrapped livestock as a yardstick. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I want to know where, and when, you are right now. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step onto a stretch of grass so broad and uninterrupted that it seems like someone rolled out a green carpet for a parade you didn't know was happening. The Georgian gentleman whose land you're wandering across doesn't see grass as just grass, it's a living canvas for status. The richer you are, the more manicured and expansive your lawn can be. And in this particular time and place, the way you show it off isn't by saying, it's about 200 feet, but by casually dropping, it's about 40 sheep from the front steps to the ha-ha. You don't ask, 40 sheep, lying down or standing up, because that's the kind of question that gets you a raised eyebrow and a quick pivot to discussing the weather. The morning hum includes the muffled thud of hooves somewhere nearby. You glance over and see a groundskeeper, probably up since before the sun, coaxing a plump ewe across the field. He's not herding her to market or to a pen, he's sizing up the space for his master's next lawn expansion. The sheep steps, the groundskeeper marks, steps again, marks again, as if this is just as natural as using a measuring tape. Here's the thing, formal, standardized measurements exist, of course. But in an era before laser rangefinders, before the Industrial Revolution pumps out cheap tools for every pocket, you often reach for whatever's at hand. And in the British countryside, sheep are everywhere. They're visible, they're tangible, and unlike a wooden rod, they don't get misplaced in the potting shed. Well, mostly. One mainstream historical fact you tuck into your back pocket: in the Georgian period, lawns were becoming a major feature of upper-class estates, thanks in part to the influence of landscape designers like Lancelot Capability Brown. His sweeping lawns looked natural but were meticulously crafted, often requiring acres of cleared space. And acres, well, acres sound impressive on paper. But when you're boasting over tea, a more visual, immediate unit, like my front sweep is 7 sheep longer than Lord Beckwith's, just hits differently. A quirky tidbit. Sometimes, rather than using an actual live sheep, estates kept a wooden sheep form for quick measuring. Imagine a plywood cutout painted white, dragged awkwardly across the grass. The live model was consulted only if a dispute arose, rather like calling in an expert witness at a trial. Historians still argue whether this whole sheep-length convention began as a genuine rural practicality or as a tongue-in-cheek bit of Gentry humor that stuck. Was it ever meant seriously, or was it always just a posh inside joke that spiraled into social currency? You watch the groundskeeper line up his sheep with studied precision, and it's hard to tell, his expression could be one of earnest calculation, or barely suppressed amusement. As you wander further, you realize the sheep-length game is more than just idle fun. There's subtle competition baked into it. The lawn is a theater stage, and the audience is your peers. Every gentleman wants his plot to feel more expansive, more liberating, more open than the next. And the sheep? They're the measuring actors, the stand-ins for the drama of land ownership. The sheep itself seems uninterested in all this human pride. It stops to chew, lifts its head to blink at you, then ambles on, trailing a little clump of burrs. The grass beneath your shoes is short, evenly cut, no mower in sight, just a century of human and animal grazing patterns perfected into this velvety surface. Somewhere, a maid opens a window, the faint clink of porcelain drifting out. You imagine the after-breakfast walk, the master of the house, a guest from the city, maybe a neighboring lord. They stroll down the path, the conversation weaving from politics to poetry to sheep lengths. From here to the folly, the master says with a glint in his eye, is just shy of 50 sheep. Would you believe? The guest nods, perhaps politely impressed, perhaps mentally calculating the comparative sheep length of his own lawn. It's absurd, yes, but it works. Sheep are a shared visual language. Even if you've never measured your own land in them, you've seen one, you know its size, you can picture it repeated over and over across a green expanse. You find yourself glancing across the lawn again, imagining ghostly rows of sheep aligned nose to tail, stretching toward the far hedge. The image is both charming and faintly ridiculous. Somewhere between those two feelings lies the real magic of Georgian lawn culture. It's part performance, part practicality, part pastoral fantasy. And, like most traditions that endure for more than a season, it's grounded in something more human than logical, our love of turning the ordinary into a shared symbol of pride. You find yourself shadowing that same groundskeeper as he leads the sheep toward a different patch of grass, the early sunlight glinting off the damp tufts on its back. You don't think of sheep as high-tech tools, but here in Georgian England, you've stumbled into a countryside hack so old-fashioned it loops back around to feeling oddly clever. The sheep, plodding along with no sense of urgency, is not just livestock, it's a living, breathing measuring rod. There's a rhythm to it. Place the animal, mark the spot, coax it forward, mark again. In time, you begin to see the appeal. Unlike a wooden yardstick, a sheep is big enough to cover respectable distance with each step. One woolly body length is instantly recognizable, no fiddly inches to squint at, no awkward metal tape to reel in. You just know. The mainstream historical fact slipping in here is that, before universal adoption of the metric or imperial systems in rural communities, people often relied on informal units based on familiar objects or body parts. You had a stone's throw, a hand for horse height, and a cartload for produce. The sheep length slots right into that tradition. It's portable in the mind and easy to communicate, especially when your audience shares the same livestock-heavy world. Your quirky tidbit. Some estate records suggest that the official sheep used for measurement wasn't always chosen for accuracy, it was chosen for personality. A particularly docile sheep would be favored, even if it was a bit shorter or longer than the county average. No one wants to measure a lawn with an animal that bolts at the sight of a sparrow. In one 1790 account, a sheep named Marjorie was so famously cooperative that her name became shorthand for an exact length, that new paths about 2 Marjories long. Historians still argue whether the first use of sheep lengths was born out of a lack of proper tools or a desire to make rural measurement sound more charming to visiting city folk. It's entirely possible that a landowner once joked about it to a London guest, only to find the idea so warmly received that it became an actual habit. After all, Georgian society loved a bit of playful eccentricity. It showed you were confident enough not to take yourself too seriously. As you watch, the groundskeeper's sheep pauses mid-measurement, turning its head toward a patch of grass just off the path. You can almost hear the sigh in the man's voice as he tugs gently on the lead, coaxing it back into alignment. Precision in sheep lengths is negotiable. You can see why disputes might arise. If your sheep has a penchant for diagonal wandering, your lawn might grow a few extra lengths overnight. The air is thick with the scent of morning, fresh-cut greenery, a distant whiff of baking bread from the kitchens, the faint musk of the sheep itself. Your shoes pick up a bit of damp earth as you trail them. Ahead, a gardener with a wheelbarrow pauses to watch, leaning on his spade. 3.5, then, he calls, his tone a blend of curiosity and mockery. The groundskeeper nods without looking up, still focused on keeping the sheep aligned. You can imagine the conversations this system sparks inside the house later. Over tea, The estate owner might share the morning's measurement as casually as discussing the weather. The number becomes a little piece of data in a long-running, unspoken contest with neighbors. We're up to 52 lengths this year. Beckwith's still at 50, last I heard. The numbers mean nothing to outsiders, but to the inner circle, they are currency. The sheep itself gives no sign of its elevated role. It grazes between moves, blinks slowly in the sun, and occasionally flicks its tail. To it, this is just a walk with snacks. You think about how this system requires not just the animal but the handler's familiarity with its quirks. Measuring with a restless sheep is like trying to take a child's height while they're mid-cartwheel. And yet, there's a certain warmth in it. A metal tape measure is cold, impersonal. A sheep length is alive. It carries the smell of wool, the sound of soft hooves on grass, the slight sway of a living creature in your hands. The process takes longer, invites conversation, and, maybe most importantly, gives everyone a reason to be out in the fresh air together. You start to see how the tradition could stick, not because it's efficient, but because it's ritual. It's an excuse for the estate's people to gather, to share in a task that's equal parts work and gentle performance. The groundskeeper finishes his final mark, gives the sheep a pat, and the animal wanders off toward a nearby paddock as if clocking out from a short shift. Somewhere in the house, a bell rings, summoning workers for the next round of duties. You follow the sound, but keep glancing back at the patch of grass now lined with small stakes, each a frozen sheep length in wood. It's easy to imagine the master walking this stretch later, hands clasped behind his back, tallying lengths in his head, already thinking about where to add the next strip of green. The lawn, after all, is never truly finished. And neither is the tradition, at least, not yet. You drift toward the manor's front approach, where the lawn stretches like a green tide in every direction, broken only by the occasional artfully placed oak. Somewhere behind you, the sheep's low bleat fades into the rustle of leaves, replaced by the faint crunch of gravel under your shoes. The path is lined with wild roses, their scent mingling with the cool, earthy air. You can feel the owner's pride radiating from the geometry of the scene, the way the grass seems impossibly level, the symmetry of flower beds, the perfectly calculated views from the front steps. Here, lawn measurement isn't just a matter of knowing where the grass ends and the ha-ha begins, it's the invisible scoreboard in a game between neighbors. You catch sight of two gentlemen near the entrance, both in neatly tailored coats, hats tipped just so. They speak in the kind of low, polite voices that somehow still carry, and you catch a snippet, 57 sheep, from the fountain to the west hedge. Beckwith's only at 54. You don't need to hear the rest to know what's going on. Estate pride runs deep in Georgian England. Your worth isn't measured only by your manners or your bloodline, it's carved into the size of your lawn. And because actual measurements in feet or yards feel a bit too coldly mathematical for bragging rights, you use a unit that feels organic. It's not just about land, it's about how the land lives, breathes, grazes. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. In this period, large country estates were increasingly designed to impress both in scale and artistry. The influence of landscape architects like Humphrey Repton meant lawns weren't just open fields, they were part of a calculated social statement, visible from the manor's main windows and designed for strolling conversation. A sweeping, uninterrupted lawn was a way of saying, I can afford to keep this land purely for beauty, not farming. But the quirky tidbit here is how sheep lengths became a sort of informal yardage for gossip. A gardener might report to his master, we're up to 60 lengths from the portico to the willow, and the number would filter into dinner table conversation. Soon, when a neighbor visits, you drop it into the chat as smoothly as commenting on the weather. Sometimes it's not even about the number itself, it's the trend. Is your lawn growing faster than theirs this year? Did you gain a length or two by subtly moving a flower bed? Historians still argue whether these competitions were mostly friendly or whether they sometimes sparked genuine resentment between families. On one hand, Georgian society prized civility and restraint. On the other, property-based rivalry was practically a national sport. You suspect it was both, most of the time a shared joke, but occasionally, under the wrong conditions, a little too pointed to be harmless. You wander past a stone sundial at the lawn's edge. The numbers carved into its base look stiff compared to the easy mental image of sheep lengths. You think about how standardized numbers can't convey the same personal touch. A lawn of 200 feet feels sterile compared to one of 30 sheep and a half, if you count the lamb. The latter invites a smile. It also invites comparison, which is exactly what the Georgian gentleman thrives on. The two men near the steps begin strolling along the path, their conversation weaving between polite inquiries and subtle one-upmanship. You imagine how a guest might feign surprise. "Only 57? I thought you'd reached 60 by now." And the host, feigning modesty, might reply, "Ah, yes, but I value quality over mere length." A prime fleeces breadth, if you will. The competition isn't all bluster, it filters into actual landscape decisions. If your rival added a sheep's length of lawn last year, you might quietly instruct your gardeners to shift a hedge, reroute a path, or clear a copse of trees to open the view and gain another 2 or 3 lengths. The sheep length thus becomes a subtle motivator for ongoing improvement, wrapped in the cozy blanket of rural tradition. From the steps, you can see how the lawn flows toward the far boundary where a stream glints in the sunlight. It looks infinite, but you know somewhere in that span, someone has marked out its exact sheep count. You picture the stakes from earlier, those quiet little markers of territory and pride, hidden in plain sight. The more you watch, the clearer it is. Sheep lengths aren't just a way of measuring, they're a way of being measured. A man's reputation, his estate's desirability, even the way guests remember a visit, all get woven into that number. And because the unit is so delightfully odd, it's disarming. No one accuses you of arrogance when you're talking about sheep. You imagine leaving this place and telling a friend, "I visited an estate that's 60 sheep long," and seeing their eyebrows lift in both confusion and amusement. That's exactly the point. A sheep-length figure carries a little story inside it, one that keeps the estate alive in conversation long after the visit ends. Somewhere out on the grass, a few real sheep graze, utterly indifferent to their role in this genteel game of status. Their slow, steady movements mirror the pace of Georgian life here, unhurried, deliberate, quietly competitive. The next morning, you spot a different group on the lawn, not lords in coats, but the estate's gardeners, clustered in quiet debate near the ha-ha. One man holds a bundle of short wooden stakes, another carries a knotted rope, and a third, clearly the senior, has a length of fleece draped over his arm like some medieval measuring tape. The fleece is a pale cream, edges fraying, and smells faintly of lanolin and sun-dried pasture. You drift closer, catching snippets of conversation. They're not arguing about how many sheep lengths the lawn measures, no, they're arguing about which sheep defines a sheep length. One insists the estate's own prime breeding ram should be the standard, solid build, good weight, stand still for measuring. Another shakes his head, that ram's far too long, makes the lawn seem smaller by count. A third suggests they use the average ewe, a more reasonable representation. It's like listening to a committee decide the official size of a foot, except the foot bleats when you poke it. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the Georgian era, there was no single official breed of sheep across England. Regional differences meant that a sheep from Lincolnshire might be noticeably longer than one from Devon. In measurement terms, that's like using different-sized rulers depending on where you are, which, as you can imagine, led to inconsistencies when gentlemen compared notes at a dinner party. The quirky tidbit. Some estates kept a sheep template in storage, a long strip of fleece attached to a rod, cut exactly to the length of their chosen model sheep. It wasn't quite as endearing as using a living animal, but it was more cooperative, especially on windy days. The rod and fleece could be rolled up and stored in the gardener's shed, safe from wandering off to eat the flower beds. Historians still argue whether this fleece tape innovation was a clever improvement or a betrayal of tradition. Purists claimed the whole point of sheep length measurement was to use an actual sheep, hoof to nose, to keep the practice rooted in the living landscape. Others insisted that in a world of competing estate measurements, a static, predictable length was necessary for fairness. One gardener, clearly on the living sheep side, throws up his hands. You start using that rag instead of a beast, might as well count it in yards like the surveyors do. There's a ripple of chuckles. Another jabs back, you'd be happy enough for yards if they made yours longer. The debate turns practical. How do you keep a sheep still long enough to mark its length without stretching its neck or curling its tail? Some swear by feeding it during the process, others claim that's cheating, as a sheep distracted by food tends to slouch forward. You realize these men have more experience in precision ovine alignment than most scientists have with microscopes. One man unfurls the fleece, laying it along the grass. The texture glows faintly in the sun, soft and uneven. He marks the end with a stake, then paces it forward, aligning each stake with the previous mark. It's strangely hypnotic, this slow, repetitive ritual. You see how it might appeal to a culture that savors process as much as outcome. A gust of wind ruffles the fleece, and the men laugh as it tangles around one's ankle. Try that with a real sheep and see how far you get, someone mutters. The conversation shifts to local gossip. Apparently, the neighboring estate uses an unusually long-legged breed, and last month's visit ended in a good-natured spat about whose measurements were inflated. You can almost picture it, two gentlemen standing on a lawn, politely accusing each other of statistical trickery, each hiding a smile. It's all very civil on the surface, but the undercurrent is there, the desire to come out ahead in a game that, officially, isn't even a game. As the gardeners work, you notice they aren't in a rush. The process itself is a kind of quiet performance, something that adds a gentle rhythm to the day. It's a task that doesn't shout for attention but quietly reinforces the estate's pride. Every stake driven into the grass isn't just a measurement, it's a reminder of the land's care, its maintenance, its place in the social map. When they finish, the fleece is rolled carefully and tucked under an arm, as if it were a relic. They leave the stakes for the master to inspect, confident he'll notice the subtle increase in length since last year. You follow their slow walk back toward the shed, feeling as if you've just watched the calibration of an oddly whimsical scientific instrument. By midday, the sun is warm enough to draw a haze above the grass, and you find yourself wandering past the sheep paddock itself. Inside the low wooden fence, a cluster of animals lounge in the shade, chewing lazily, their sides rising and falling like a row of furry bellows. You notice almost immediately they're not all the same size. Some are stocky, their bodies compact and wool thick, others are longer and leaner, legs more pronounced. The difference is more than cosmetic. Here, in the Georgian countryside, sheep breeds are as regional as accents, and each has its own standard length. The mainstream historical fact: England in the Georgian era hosted a variety of sheep breeds tied closely to local conditions. The Southdown, popular in Sussex, was short and sturdy, bred for high-quality meat. The Lincoln Longwool, from further north, could be dramatically longer in body, draped in locks of wool that reached nearly to the ground. A sheep length in Sussex was simply not the same as a sheep length in Lincolnshire, something that made inter-county lawn comparisons gloriously unreliable. The quirky tidbit comes in the form of a story you overhear from a farmhand leaning on the fence. He swears that one visiting gentleman, eager to boost his estate's sheep length count, secretly swapped his measuring sheep for a Lincoln Longwool borrowed from a cousin up north. The switch went unnoticed until a neighboring lord visited and remarked, "Good heavens, your sheep look stretched." The Longwool was quietly returned the next week, and the lawn's count quietly dropped by 4 lengths overnight. Historians still argue whether these breed differences were ever formally adjusted when counts were shared at social gatherings. Some believe gentlemen mentally calibrated for regional variation, the way you might adjust for a friend's tendency to exaggerate fish sizes. Others suspect no such correction was ever made. Part of the fun was in the fuzziness, the plausible deniability when one lawn came out suspiciously ahead. You lean on the paddock rail, letting your eyes wander between breeds. The South Downs look like overstuffed cushions, faces almost hidden by wool, while the Longwools resemble regal drapes on legs. A younger gardener approaches with a halter, clearly here to fetch a measuring sheep. He bypasses the smaller South Downs and chooses a medium-sized Leicester, a practical compromise between stoutness and stretch. The animal follows him with a slow, swaying gait toward the main lawn, where fresh stakes and a string of pale flags mark a new measuring run. You follow at a distance, watching as he positions the sheep at the starting point, its nose brushing a painted stone that probably serves as the 0 marker. Each move forward is methodical, the gardener setting the sheep's stance before planting the next stake. A light breeze stirs the smell of cut grass, mingled with something distinctly sheepish, warm, animal, earthy. The sound of distant laughter drifts from the house, maybe guests being told the very story you just overheard. You can almost script it. Yes, but you know they measure with the Longwools up there. Practically cheating, I say. Your mind starts to play with the possibilities. If 2 gentlemen from different regions decided to settle a lawn-length dispute, whose sheep would they use? Would they choose a neutral breed, or insist on home field advantage? In the absence of any governing body of sheep measurement, these questions stayed delightfully unanswered. From where you stand, you can see the gentle slope of the estate's backfield, dotted with sheep like white clouds fallen to earth. The breeds are mixed, a sign that the estate values both wool and meat, and perhaps also likes the visual texture of variety. A purely aesthetic decision? Maybe. Or maybe an intentional nod to the fact that here, even the measuring unit can be chosen for its charm. When the gardener finishes his run, he gives the sheep a final pat and releases it back toward the paddock. It trots, surprisingly spry, into the shade where the others lounge. You watch it disappear among its shorter and longer cousins, just another unit of length until it's called up again. The afternoon light slants golden through the tall windows of the manor's drawing room, casting long rectangles across a Persian rug that could swallow an entire cottage floor. You've wandered inside, following the hum of polite conversation. The air smells faintly of tea, beeswax polish, and the lingering smoke from the morning's fire. Porcelain cups clink softly, lace cuffs brush against polished wood. Here, the sheep length leaves the field and slips into genteel parlor chatter. 2 ladies sit near the hearth, embroidery hoops in hand, and a gentleman stands by the sideboard, swirling brandy in a cut crystal glass. You catch a snippet of dialogue, just as smooth as it is absurd, from the orangery to the pond. Oh, 3 sheep and a bit. But only if you use the Leicester. It's not a joke exactly, but the faint lift of a smile tells you the amusement is part of the pleasure. This isn't a world where you drop measurements in yards or feet. Here, you drop them in units that carry pastoral charm, conjuring images of sunlit lawns dotted with grazing animals. It's a soft flex, the way someone might mention the square footage of their summer villa, except you dress it in wool. The mainstream historical fact: in Georgian high society, conversation often doubled as subtle self-promotion. Without seeming gauche, you could hint at your wealth, your taste, or your landholdings simply by recounting everyday details. A sheep-length lawn measurement was exactly that, a harmless-sounding fact that still placed your estate squarely on the social leaderboard. For your quirky tidbit, you overhear a footman whisper to another by the door. One particularly theatrical hostess kept a miniature silver sheep on her tea table. If a guest inquired about the length of her garden walk, She would delicately place the figurine on the table and slide it along 3 times, perhaps with a half-step for precision. 3 sheep and a bit, she would say with mock seriousness, as though conducting a royal decree. Historians still argue whether such drawing-room sheep banter was rooted in genuine country tradition or whether, by the time it reached fashionable London salons, it had already transformed into a kind of parody of rural manners. Some suspect urban Georgians adopted it precisely because it felt rustic and charming, like wearing riding boots when you've never been near a stable. The gentleman with the brandy leans toward a guest and, without breaking eye contact, says, "The North Lawn? 45 if you're counting the lamb." The guest chuckles, swirling his own glass. The conversation drifts to a neighbor's hedge maze, measured, naturally, in ewes. You realize these aren't isolated remarks, they're part of an ongoing social game, a playful, low-stakes rivalry that gives everyone a shared language. As the laughter swells and softens again, you picture the earlier measuring scene, the stakes in the grass, the gardener's careful coaxing, the sheep's distracted grazing. Out here, the process is stripped away, the number becomes pure currency, detached from the muddy boots and sheepy smells it came from. It's been polished into something you can pass hand to hand in conversation without soiling your lace cuffs. The tea service is cleared, replaced by a plate of sugared almonds. You notice how the rhythm of talk flows from weather to gardens to family news, always circling back to property in some form. Sheep lengths fit right into that loop, they bridge the practical outdoors and the polished indoors. They allow a gentleman to nod toward his estate without having to recite acreage or produce deeds. A small dog curls under the table, sighing in its sleep. You think about how, if these people could get away with measuring their lawns in spaniels, they probably would, but sheep have the advantage of being both rural and respectable, tied to centuries of English husbandry. You lean against the doorway, letting the words wash over you, the cadence soothing, the imagery faintly ridiculous. It's a reminder that not all status symbols have to be cold or flashy, sometimes they're woolly, slow, and entirely unaware they're part of the game. You're back outside the next morning, the grass still wet enough to cling to your shoes. A low fog curls along the edges of the lawn, and in it you catch a silhouette, a groundskeeper, hands on hips, staring at a sheep that has wandered several paces off the carefully marked measuring line. The animal is nose-deep in a patch of particularly lush clover, oblivious to the fact that it's just thrown off the morning's measurements. This is the great flaw of the living yardstick. It has opinions, and tastes, and a stubborn refusal to be rushed. You watch the man tug gently at the lead, his boots squelching in the damp earth. The sheep flicks an ear, takes one more bite, then ambles back toward the stakes as if doing him a personal favor. Your mainstream historical fact: while estate measuring in sheep lengths was a genteel tradition, actual livestock behavior was anything but refined. Sheep are famously distractible, prone to sudden starts, and especially during rutting season, entirely uncooperative. Georgian journals occasionally mention the art of selecting a calm animal for the job, hinting that the skill was as much about animal handling as about geometry. The quirky tidbit: one recorded measurement day was abandoned entirely when the designated sheep broke loose and led 3 gardeners, a butler, and the master himself on a half-mile chase into the orchard. The gentlemen guests were reportedly delighted, considering it the most entertaining lawn inspection they'd ever attended. Historians still argue whether these wandering sheep mishaps were truly accidents or sometimes staged for the amusement of visiting company. After all, a genteel lawn measuring session might make for polite conversation, but a sheep bolting through the rose garden? That's a story that gets retold for years. The fog begins to lift, revealing the stakes from yesterday, neat in their row. The groundskeeper resets the sheep at the starting stone, muttering under his breath. You can almost hear the calculation in his head: how much length was lost by the detour, whether the count is still fair, whether the master will notice. Each move forward feels like a negotiation. The man's steady pressure on the lead, the sheep's slow, grudging steps. You realize that even the act of holding a sheep straight is a small performance, too tight and it balks, too loose and it wanders. Measuring like this isn't a job for someone impatient. From your vantage point, the image is absurd and strangely charming. A man, a sheep, and the vast sweep of lawn, all bathed in soft morning light. The stakes glint with dew, marking progress in silent increments. Every so often the sheep pauses to sniff the air, as if it's aware of its role but not entirely sold on the idea. A second gardener joins them, holding a small bucket. You smell the contents before you see them, grain and something sweet, maybe molasses. This, it turns out, is the secret weapon. At each mark, the bucket is offered, the sheep takes a mouthful, and then, almost willingly, steps forward. It's bribery, pure and simple, but it works. By the end of the run, the fog has burned off completely, the sun glinting on the manor's windows. The sheep shakes itself, scattering droplets into the air, and is led back to the paddock. The men step aside to admire the new row of stakes, as if they've just laid down a string of pearls. You think about how easily this whole ritual could be replaced with a proper measuring tool. But then you imagine the absence of these slow negotiations, the absence of cloverstall detours and molasses bribes, and it suddenly feels like a loss. The imprecision is part of the charm, the wandering part of the story. Without it, you'd just have numbers, dry, accurate, forgettable. By the week's end, the story of a runaway measuring sheep has already made its way into print. You're standing in the village, outside a small shop that smells of ink and drying paper, leafing through the latest broadsheet. Right there on the second page is a woodcut cartoon, a portly gentleman in breeches chasing a sheep that's leaping over a flower bed, gardeners and maids in hot pursuit, the caption reading, "Length uncertain, spirit unmeasured." Satire was a quiet but persistent current in Georgian life, and sheep length measuring was ripe for it. Period humorists loved poking fun at the Gentry's peculiarities, especially when they involved something as delightfully ridiculous as pacing out lawns with livestock. The broadsheets didn't have to exaggerate much, the image of a man of refinement wielding a bleating ruler was funny enough. Your mainstream historical fact: London and provincial newspapers in the 18th and early 19th centuries often carried light satire alongside serious political news. Gentle digs at aristocratic habits were common, framed in ways that were playful enough not to cause real offense, especially if they could be passed off as purely fictional. The quirky tidbit in your hands now: one notorious cartoonist drew an entire mock sheep conversion chart showing how to translate between sheep lengths, hog lengths, and the questionable turkey trot unit, illustrated with increasingly alarmed animals. It was an instant hit, reprinted by at least 3 papers within the month, much to the delight of readers and the quiet annoyance of certain landowners. Historians still argue whether these satirical takes helped spread the sheep-length tradition beyond rural estates, or whether they slowly undermined it by turning it into a public joke. Some believe the ribbing actually strengthened its popularity. There's a certain social power in embracing what others tease you for. You carry the broadsheet out into the street, the crisp paper crackling in your hands. The village green is just visible from here, a few real sheep grazing beyond a low fence, blissfully unaware they're cultural icons. You imagine the cartoon sheep, wild-eyed, mid-leap, superimposed over the calm reality in front of you. Back at the manor later that afternoon, the master chuckles as he folds his own copy of the paper. "They've drawn my coat all wrong," he says, feigning indignation, though you can tell he's secretly pleased. A guest teases, "Perhaps you should measure in pigs, less likely to bolt." That sparks a new round of laughter and mock-serious debate about the merits of various barnyard measuring units. In the drawing room that evening, someone pulls out the cartoon again, tracing the exaggerated swoop of the sheep's back. Conversation turns to other printed jabs, pamphlets that pretend to offer scientific guidelines for selecting the ideal measuring sheep, complete with absurd anatomical diagrams. The guests howl at the image of a sheep fitted with a carpenter's level across its spine. You notice that for all the mockery, no one here seems inclined to abandon the practice. If anything, the humor has given it a fresh burst of life, a reason to bring it up in company without seeming to boast outright. The lawn's length is now both a point of pride and a running joke, perfectly Georgian in its balance of vanity and wit. The next day, you find yourself in the estate's small library, a room heavy with the scent of leather bindings and beeswax. Sunlight filters through tall sash windows, pooling on a mahogany table where several slim volumes lie open. They're not novels or poetry, but early agricultural journals, pages of dense type and meticulous engravings of sheep, ploughs, and pasture layouts. Someone has left a page marked with a ribbon. The headline catches your eye. On the standardization of rural measures, notes on the sheep length. It's a serious attempt, from what you can tell, to bring order to the chaos. The author proposes that an official sheep length be based on a specific breed, age, and stance, complete with diagrams showing the correct alignment of head and tail. Your mainstream historical fact: early agricultural societies in Britain, such as the Board of Agriculture founded in 1793, genuinely sought to standardize farming practices, including measurements. While they focused more on acres and bushels, some experimental minds occasionally ventured into codifying more unusual rural units, like sheep lengths, if only to humor landowners. The quirky tidbit here is that one such scientific proposal recommended building a life-sized wooden sheep to serve as the master standard, to be stored at the society's headquarters. Anyone wishing to verify their measurements could, in theory, compare their sheep to the official model. The idea never caught on, partly because no one could agree on which county's sheep to model it after, and partly because, well, it was a wooden sheep. Historians still argue whether these earnest attempts at standardization were driven by genuine agricultural needs or by tongue-in-cheek nods to fashionable gentry quirks. Some papers from the time read as though the authors are entirely serious, others carry a faint whiff of mischief between the lines. You flip through the pages, tracing the engravings. There's something endearing about the mix of pastoral charm and scholarly rigor, footnotes explaining wool density, tables of average sheep lengths by county, even a formula for adjusting measurements in cases of seasonal girth fluctuation. You can almost picture a Georgian gentleman solemnly multiplying his sheep length count by a shearing coefficient to impress a guest with mathematical precision. The room is quiet except for the faint ticking of a bracket clock on the mantel. Outside the window, you spot the familiar sight of a gardener leading a sheep across the lawn, methodical as ever. From this distance, the scene could almost be a living illustration for the article in front of you. You imagine what it would be like if the Agricultural Society's standard had actually been adopted, gentlemen sending letters to one another, comparing their certified sheep length counts, perhaps even boasting of having the Society's seal on their measurements. It would turn a playful rural tradition into something bureaucratic, stripping away its whimsy. Maybe that's why it never happened. The beauty of the sheep length lies in its flexibility, its mild chaos. It's as much about the process and the conversation as the result. Standardization might make it easier to compare lawns across counties, but it would also flatten the story, making it just another number. You close the journal and set it back on the shelf, brushing your fingertips over the embossed spine. The titles around it speak of crop rotations, orchard care, and wool grading, serious, necessary subjects. The sheep length sits on the fringe of that world, not quite essential, but not without its own peculiar value. Back outside, the sunlight has shifted, casting long shadows from the stakes in the grass. The sheep ambles along, blissfully unaware that somewhere in a library, people have debated the perfect way to measure its body. It's late afternoon when you wander toward the manor's side wing, where the workshop smells faintly of sawdust and linseed oil. Inside, benches are strewn with curious tools, planes, calipers, lengths of twine, even a brass compass whose hinge squeaks when you open it. This is where the sheep length measuring devices take shape, crafted with the kind of care usually reserved for clocks or fine cabinets. A carpenter in a rolled-up shirt is bent over a plank, sketching the outline of something that looks suspiciously like a sheep's silhouette. He glances up, grins, and explains that it's a new measuring frame, a hinged wooden contraption that can be set to match the exact length of the estate's official sheep. Once adjusted, it can be carried across the lawn, no risk of bolting, no temptation to snack on the flower beds. Your mainstream historical fact: the Georgian era saw a rise in gentlemen tinkerers, wealthy men who dabbled in engineering, mechanics, and inventive gadgets, often applying their creativity to agricultural life. Tools were custom-built to suit the quirks of a particular estate, from seed drills to elaborate dovecot ladders. The quirky tidbit sitting in front of you is this: one particularly enthusiastic inventor once created a sheep-length measuring device mounted on wheels, complete with a counter that ticked off each length like a giant pedometer. His peers loved it, until the wheels left ruts in the lawn so deep they had to reseed the entire north field. Historians still argue whether such contraptions were genuine labor-saving tools or simply status symbols for showing off one's ingenuity to visiting friends. Given how many were impractical, it's possible the latter was often the case. The carpenter shows you a small brass plaque engraved with the sheep's name, Daisy 2, that will be fixed to the frame. Makes it more official, he says with a wink. He demonstrates how the hinge locks in place, the wood fitting together with a satisfying click. It's elegant in its way, though you can't help thinking it lacks the quiet charm of the living version. Nearby, a shelf holds earlier prototypes, one frame with adjustable legs for uneven terrain, another painted in alternating black and white stripes for better visibility in low light. One even has a small leather handle, as though you might take it for a stroll like a pet. From the open doorway, you catch a glimpse of the real sheep grazing peacefully in the paddock. No hinges, no paint stripes, no counter, just the steady rhythm of jaw and grass. You realize the carpenter's device solves the problems of wandering and bribery, but also removes the little unpredictabilities that make the ritual memorable. Still, the idea of a mechanical sheep length has its own appeal, especially for estates where a sheep might not be readily available. You imagine a future where visitors could buy their own portable sheep from a London shop, complete with instructions and perhaps a carrying case lined in velvet. The carpenter wraps the finished frame in canvas and sets it against the wall, ready for tomorrow's trial run. The light slants through the high windows, catching motes of dust in slow spirals. Outside, you hear the faint bleat of the living Daisy 2, perhaps reminding everyone that no matter how clever the tools get, she's still the gold standard. By morning, the air carries that faint lanolin sweet scent you only notice when you've been around sheep for a while. Out on the drive, carts are rolling in from neighboring farms, each stacked with bales of fleece, cream, charcoal, and the occasional warm brown. The annual wool market is on, and you can feel the shift in energy. You drift between the carts, fingers brushing the springy fibers, overhearing deals struck in low voices. The Georgian wool trade was no small matter. It was a pillar of the rural economy. A good year for fleece meant full larders and happy books, and the right sheep could be as much a source of pride as a fine horse or a prized hound. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Britain's wool exports in the 18th and early 19th centuries were a major economic driver, with certain breeds, like the Lincoln Longwool or Cotswold, fetching especially high prices. Landowners cultivated their flocks not just for profit, but for prestige at agricultural fairs. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some gentlemen quietly used their best, show-quality sheep as their measuring sheep, believing that a longer, more impressive specimen reflected better on their estate. It was a sly way to tie their lawn's grandeur directly to their prize-winning livestock. Of course, this meant that if the sheep took a prize at a fair, guests might knowingly glance at the garden and think, yes, that's 4 lengths of champion right there. Historians still argue whether the connection between wool markets and sheep length measuring was conscious economic symbolism or simply a case of the same sheep doing double duty. The truth probably shifts from estate to estate, some pragmatic, some theatrical. As you wander toward the market square, you notice a few stalls selling more than fleece: ribbons for decorating rams, brushes for grooming, even tiny brass plaques engraved with names. One vendor leans in conspiratorially, offering a precision halter designed to keep a measuring sheep standing perfectly still. It's clear this culture of measurement has spun off its own little economy. You pass a group of gentlemen deep in conversation about wool yield per sheep length, a nonsense figure, but delivered with such earnestness you wonder if they're halfway to convincing themselves. One pulls out a folded paper covered in columns of numbers, clearly delighted to be blending business with this slightly absurd pastime. Later, back at the estate, the master inspects his own bales of fleece with the same pride he shows his lawns. You start to see the symmetry. The sheep's body determines the measure of the grass, and its fleece brings in the income that keeps the grass looking pristine. The two worlds are not as separate as you thought. In the late light, you watch as Daisy too is led out for her evening graze. Her wool catches the sun, glowing almost gold. For a moment, she's not just a yardstick on legs, she's the quiet link between lawn, livelihood, and local bragging rights. The morning fog clings low to the hedgerows as you hear the crisp clop of a horse along the drive. A tall man in a dark coat dismounts, rolls up a leather map tube, and steps onto the gravel with the deliberate gait of someone about to measure something, officially. This is a surveyor, one of those trained professionals who relies on chains, rods, and theodolites, not sheep. You follow him toward the lawn, where the estate's master greets him politely but with an edge of defensiveness. They both know why he's here: to assess the property in precise units that will be recorded in legal documents, not parlor conversations. Your mainstream historical fact: in Georgian Britain, the Gunter's chain, a 66-foot measuring chain of 100 links, was the standard for surveying land. It was exact, reproducible, and accepted in court. Your quirky tidbit: some gentry tried to reconcile the two systems by converting their lawn's official chain-measured length into sheep lengths, creating hybrids like 38 chains, or about 112 sheep. It rarely matched perfectly, and the mismatches sometimes became the subject of long, good-natured arguments over port. Historians still argue whether these tensions between surveyors and landowners were rooted in genuine mistrust of cold measurements or just in the desire to preserve a social ritual that official tools couldn't capture. The surveyor unspools his chain with brisk efficiency, planting stakes at intervals. The gardener, arms folded, watches Daisy 2 munch clover nearby, his expression clearly saying, "My way works fine, thanks." The chain clinks as it's reeled in and moved forward, an entirely different rhythm from the slow amble of a sheep across the turf. At one point, the master gestures toward Daisy 2 and asks, only half joking, whether the chain can account for seasonal fluff. The surveyor doesn't dignify it with more than a twitch of a smile. You can feel the polite standoff in the air: precision versus tradition, ink and paper versus anecdote and nods. The two men walk the length of the lawn, marking numbers on a ledger and, more subtly, marking their philosophical differences. When they finish, the master insists on one last check, pacing the same distance with Daisy 2. Naturally, the numbers don't quite match. He claps the surveyor on the back and declares, "Close enough for the lawn, perfect for the ledger." It's a compromise of sorts. Each system gets its moment, and the lawn keeps both its legal and its whimsical measurement. As the surveyor rides away, you notice the gardener already pulling out his chalk and stakes, ready to reassert the sheep-length version for tomorrow's visitors. A week later, you sense something shifting in the air, not in the weather, but in the way people talk about measuring. There's a new contraption rolling into fashion: sleek, brass-edged measuring wheels, telescoping rods, and folding tape measures imported from the city. The Georgian world is tilting toward the industrial age, and the sheep-length tradition is starting to wobble. Your mainstream historical fact: by the early 19th century, precision measuring instruments were becoming cheaper and more widely available, thanks to advances in manufacturing. Surveying and landscaping could now be done with far greater speed and uniformity, appealing to estates that valued efficiency. Your quirky tidbit: one estate attempted to blend the old and the new by painting their measuring wheel to look like a sheep, complete with painted fleece patterns and a little carved head. It was charming, for about a week, until the paint chipped and it looked like a diseased goat. Historians still argue whether the decline of sheep-length measurement was inevitable progress or the result of a conscious rejection of fussy rural customs by a generation eager to be seen as modern. You watch as a young heir, fresh from a season in London, insists on remeasuring the drive with a shiny brass tape. He calls out numbers to the gardener as though announcing horse race results. The gardener, clearly unimpressed, mutters about losing the soul of it. In the market town, tool shops display polished metal rulers alongside the usual agricultural gear. Merchants pitch them as impervious to grazing and wholly reliable in all seasons, a dig, no doubt, at the stubborn unpredictability of sheep. And people are buying them. Even Daisy too seems to notice her reduced workload. She spends more time in the paddock now, her services called upon only for tradition's sake or visiting children's amusement. Without the regular lawn walks, she's rounder, fluffier, and if sheep can be, slightly smug. One evening, the master walks the lawn alone, tape measure dangling from his hand. He stops halfway, glances toward the paddock, and you can almost see the hesitation. The numbers on the tape are neat and unquestionable, but they lack that odd personal charm of saying, yes, this stretch is exactly 3 2/3 Daisy 2. The slow fade has begun. Tools hum in city workshops, iron rails stretch into the countryside, and the sheep length, while not gone, has started its steady retreat into memory. By the time the leaves start to turn, you notice the talk of sheep lengths has drifted into the realm of after-dinner stories rather than practical use. The young ones treat it as a quaint joke, the older ones recall it with a faint ache of nostalgia. It's become a party trick for the past, like demonstrating how people once thought bathing once a month was healthy. Your mainstream historical fact: during the Victorian era, which followed the Georgian, there was a marked shift toward scientific landscaping and precise horticultural measurement. Manuals and gardening periodicals promoted exact spacing, depth, and proportion, all in imperial units. Sheep were seldom, if ever, mentioned in these guides. Your quirky tidbit: one eccentric dowager in Derbyshire stubbornly kept her lawn sheep compliant into the 1870s, even commissioning a painted portrait of her final measuring ewe in an ornate gold frame. The frame was engraved not with the sheep's name, but with the estate's record: lawn, 12 sheep, no more, no less. Historians still argue whether the sheep-length tradition ever truly vanished or if it simply went underground, surviving in rural estates where old habits clung stubbornly, invisible to urban eyes. In the estate's great hall, you hear an aging uncle recount the tale of Daisy Two's great-grandam pacing out the south terrace for a visiting duke. His voice slows as if he's stretching the memory out, savoring it before it slips away. The younger listeners smirk, but a few lean in, intrigued despite themselves. Meanwhile, the physical traces fade. The stakes once used for lawn marking are stacked in the shed, half covered in cobwebs. The chalk lines on the gravel are gone, washed away by seasons of rain. Daisy too still grazes, but now she's simply the sheep, without the gentle weight of ceremonial duty. Walking the perimeter of the lawn at dusk, you imagine it as it was, each stretch paced by hooves, each measurement sealed with a nod and a satisfied smile. You realize traditions don't always end with a bang. Sometimes they just soften, like old wool worn thin but still warm in places. The years unspool quietly, and by now the sheep length is more folklore than fact. Daisy too is long gone, her descendants living in comfortable anonymity in the meadow beyond the orchard. The estate's lawns are still trimmed, but measured in feet, yards, and occasionally chains, numbers that sit tidily in ledgers, never in stories. Your mainstream historical fact: by the end of the 19th century, Britain's land measurement was fully standardized under the imperial system, with agricultural societies enforcing these units for competitions and estate records. What had once been regional quirks were now streamlined into national uniformity. Your quirky tidbit: in one corner of the country, a gardening club briefly tried to revive sheep lengths as a whimsical feature of their annual show. It failed after 2 years, not because no one enjoyed it, but because the measuring sheep kept eating the prize dahlias before the judging. Historians still argue whether the memory of sheep-length lawns persists because of its eccentricity or because it quietly symbolized a gentler, slower relationship with land, one where measurements came not from lifeless tools, but from living, breathing animals who shaped the place as much as they quantified it. On a crisp autumn afternoon, you find yourself alone at the far end of the lawn, the house behind you glowing in the low sun. You close your eyes and picture the careful amble of a ewe across the grass, the pause to nibble here and there, the gardener's muttered arithmetic, the master's approving nod. The present world hums in the distance, train whistles, cartwheels, and somewhere, the steady tick of a brass pocket watch. But here, just for a breath, you can feel the old cadence of hoofbeats in the turf, and you measure the space not in yards or meters, but in the slow, soft, wool-wrapped lengths that once defined it. And then you let it go, because all traditions, however odd, eventually find their resting place, not vanished, but folded into the long fabric of history, where they wait for curious minds to unroll them again. The lawn lies still in the fading light, and your voice eases into the wind down. The edges of memory blur here, like the edges of the hedge against the dusk sky, until you can't quite tell where the real ends and the imagined begins. You let the words stretch, unhurried, each one softer than the last. Imagine the lawn as it is now, quiet, cool, dew settling like faint glass beads on each blade of grass. Somewhere beyond, the last sheep of the day settles in the meadow, its breathing slow, a metronome for the night. You take a slow breath yourself, and in that moment, the noise of modern time fades. No chains clinking, no shouts from the market, no ticking of instruments, just the silence of a place content to be exactly as it is. The stars come out one by one, and the world shrinks to the small patch of earth beneath your feet, a space that doesn't need to be measured anymore. It is what it is, enough, whole, unbroken. And as you let your thoughts drift, you carry the image of those long, woolly paces somewhere deep inside, where they'll stay until you feel like walking them again, in dreams.